Welcome to the Storypowers Podcast, the show about the power of stories, the people who tell them, and why you should be doing it too. I'm your host, keynote speaker and storytelling coach, Francisco Mahfuz. My guest today is Karen Eber. Karen's an author, international consultant, and keynote speaker that specializes in leadership and storytelling. Her TED Talk on storytelling has been seen almost 2 million times, and her book, The Perfect Story, will be published by Harper Collins next year. In many ways, Karen and I are very much like each other, but not exactly the same. We both like Bon Iver's music, but she loves the Airborne Toxic event, and I definitely don't. I
You
have green
don't?
eyes, but only one of her eyes. I do not. I have green eyes, but only one of her eyes is green. We both talk about the science of storytelling, but she was actually smart enough to turn that into a hugely successful TED Talk. And I wasn't. Oh well, at least I get compliments on the color of both of my eyes on a regular basis. So I guess everyone is a winner. Ladies and gentlemen, Karen Eber. Karen, welcome to the show.
I'm delighted to be here. I'm sorry at my shock about airborne toxic event. First, I'm always happy when people know who they are, but then when I hear someone isn't a fan, it's a little crushing.
Well, to be honest, I wasn't particularly aware of them. I heard you mention them in a different podcast, so I went and looked them up, and I listened to some stuff liked, some stuff not so much, and then I read up on them a little bit, and I found out that they're very far from a unanimous a unanimous band. So I don't think this comes as a massive shock to you that I'm not a huge fan.
Well, I'll tell you what I like about them is that their lead singer is an author and he does a lot of creative writing. And their song that took off is called Sometime Around Midnight. And it's really this story about how he had a love and lost the love and this night where he sees her in a bar at midnight. And so part of what is so compelling about their songs is that it's just this music, poetry set to music. So it's always about story.
Um, all right, so one of the things that I was quite curious to find out from you after I was doing my research. I watched the talk and read up on a whole bunch of stuff. And one of the first things that came to my mind was when you were putting together your TED talk. How did you choose the stories for it? Because I think the story you tell closer to the end about the data and about the person who, I think, which was the mother of someone who had some difficulties. That story made complete sense to me. The first story, I was hearing, and I was like, I really don't know where she's going with this one. Let's see how she lands. And it obviously it lands, but what made you choose? I think it's probably worth mentioning what the story is and what did you choose? Why did you choose that one to start your talk on storytelling?
A bit of background. I love you asked this. I didn't start there. When I had the opportunity to give the talk as a storyteller, I started to think about what are the stories that I've told that have really resonated with people. And there's one or two that people always ask for. And I thought, I'm going to tell those. That's my greatest hits. That's what I'm going to do. And the talk wasn't working and I couldn't understand why. I just kept trying to force it. And it wasn't until I stepped back and thought, well, why don't you work your storytelling process and really thought about the audience that I made the shift because I was struggling a little bit in the audience that I gave the talk in front of was a group of university students, but the big portion of the audience that would see the talk would be business professionals. And I was trying to figure out how do I tell a story that works for both. And I was talking to a friend about this one story I kept trying to cram in there. And she said, you have to kill it. Like, I know you love that story and it's a good story, but you have to kill it. And the moment she said that, it gave me the permission to let go of this story because it's not the story I want to tell. It's the story the audience needs to hear. And I had this experience, and I'll share the story about this woman, Maria, who is getting into the elevator at work, and she's going to press the button. Her phone falls out of her hands, and it bounces on the floor. She lunges for it. Just when you think she's going to grab it, it goes right down the opening between the elevator and the floor, right down the shaft. And she's screaming like, no, just like you would see in slow motion. The phone is gone. It falls 3 stories to the basement, and it is a iPhone. She has an Apple Watch, and she can text she can test it and see that it's still working amazingly. So she goes to the front desk and she asks the guard, Ray, for help. And he's just delighted to see her because he's in the front of the building every morning. And every morning, hundreds of people walk past and maybe give the polite wave, but they don't stop to talk to him, except Maria knows your birthday and your last vacation and your favorite meal. And it's not that she's this nosy person. It's just that she really cares about people being seen. She really cares about connecting with people and celebrating who they are. And so when Ray sees her walk up, he's smiling until she tells him what happened. And his smile just goes away because he realizes this is going to be expensive. It's going to be about $500 because they have to shut down all of the elevators in the building, call in a service call, go down. It's a very involved process. And he tells her this, that it's going to be quite expensive. She asks him, just go ahead and get a quote. If it's under $250, do it. If it's more, then call me and let me know. Because it's not just her phone, it's a wallet, it's her driver's license, a credit card, her badge, like it's everything. And a few minutes later, he calls her and says, I actually looked at the certificate in the elevator. It's due for inspection next month. I can call it in now. As a part of the inspection, they will get your phone back. We won't charge you anything. So the same day this happened, because this was actually a true event that happened in my office, I was reading an article in the New York Times about Walt Benninger, who's the CEO of Charles Schwab. And he describes this really pivotal moment in his career as a leader. And when he learned what was important to him as a leader, how he was in his last exam at university, straight A's, walking into that business final, expecting to ace it, gets in there. The professor hands out a sheet of paper and tells everyone to turn it over. When they do, it is completely blank. They're all looking around confused. And the professor says, I have taught you everything there is to know about business except this one thing. What is the name of the person that cleans this room? And he failed it. He saw her. He probably even smiled at her, but he never introduced himself. He never talked to her and didn't know her name. And he learned that her name was Dottie. And that moment left such an impression on him that he vowed for the rest of his career, he was always going to know all of the Dotties in his life. And both Walter and Maria understand this power of helping people feel seen as leaders. They understand how compelling it is when you make someone not only feel seen, but understood. So that was the opening story I chose because it works for university students. It works for business students. It helps land this concept of leadership and how you're helping people feel seen in a way that's so much more compelling than if I just listed off all the facts of it. We all have phones. They're important in our lives. The thought of a phone dropping down and potentially losing it and having to replace it, in addition to driver's license, credit cards, like it creates that feeling of, ugh. In fact, in the front row, someone said, oh no, in the talk, which you can hear very briefly on the video because it's a very relatable thing. And so to me, it was such a great way to illustrate how much work stories can do for us in informing, influencing, and inspiring, which is where a lot of my work is in helping people use storytelling in business.
So what was the story that you were trying to cram in there that wasn't working? You don't have to tell me the whole story, but what was roughly the story about and the point of it? Because now I'm curious to figure out what you were trying to do and why it didn't actually work.
One story that I used, so before I opened my own company, I was a head of culture and a chief learning officer at General Electric. And I was responsible for the culture for 90,000 employees in 150 countries. And culture isn't what the CEO says on stage. It's what each person internalizes and thinks that they want to do, how they want to act each day. So if you want to shape culture, you have to find a way to touch each person and allow for them to have that reflection and set intentions, which is really hard to do. And I started using storytelling. The business I was in was going through significant changes. And I told this story about make waffles, not spaghetti. And the idea is that the employee that is going through all of these changes, all of this stress, like any person today, their brain is like a jumbled plate of spaghetti, jumbled mess of noodles where, you can't really get just one noodle. There's a whole bunch of them. And when you're trying to eat them, they slap you in the chin. And it's just this jumbled mess that isn't organized, because employees get overwhelmed, and trying to figure out the path forward is really hard. And the role of a leader in helping employees navigate change is figuring out that path forward. And so in a workshop, I told leaders, I want you to picture a plate of waffles where it's row after row of these nicely organized squares, and you can put as much butter, syrup, or whatever you want in them, and you can focus on one. All the others are there, but you don't have to pay attention to them all at once. It's focusing on what's most important in that moment. Your job as a leader is to make waffles for your employees, not spaghetti. How can you come in each day and see where can you focus people on what they want? So that's the abridged version, but it always resonated with people and they loved it. And I thought, oh, I'll work that in. And it just wasn't the right story. And I'm so glad that it didn't make it in.
Yeah, I guess that I think not having heard the story, so maybe I'm judging it more harshly than perhaps it needed to be judged. I think my first instinct is that it's very much, to me, sounds more like a story you share in a workshop, a story you share with leaders that are already in that issue,
Yep.
than a story where you can very easily make a clear connection between, real life and this lesson that is connected to the thing I want to talk about. And from when I talk, I tend to find that I have a lot of those stories in there, and stories that refer to specific companies, because I'm trying to show that other companies actually do it this way. Other companies use storytelling. So I tend to find that that's not where you want an analogy type of story. That's where you want, okay, so this is the story of some other company doing this. But if I'm trying to make a broader point about storytelling, then I tend to find that the story that has nothing to do with storytelling, or with culture, or with whatever, it works. So I talk about culture as well, and there's one story that I always put in the talk, any storytelling talk I do really, which is about something that happened to my wife last year, where essentially she got shafted by her boss leaving her job. She gave her notice. They asked to talk to her. The boss gave her a real hard time, like said some pretty outrageous stuff to her, like, how dare you think another company is going to be better than us after we allowed you to work from home during the lockdown. We didn't fire you when you got pregnant, stuff like that. So she signed the papers they put in front of her because she didn't want to be there any another second. And they took 2 weeks of her salary away because she hadn't given her notice, supposedly. But she did it over the phone, so she didn't have anything in writing, and they got away with it. So I share a stat about people leaving their jobs and being taken advantage of by their employers. And I say to people, I'm going to ruin your day now. And then I share the stat, and nobody looks particularly upset. I was like, okay, but that didn't work. Then I share my wife's story, and then I say, well, listen, how are you feeling right now? And people go, I'm really angry. What's the name of the company? I'm going to go. And then I use that to make the point about how we shouldn't, but we care about one person more than we care about thousands of people. Yep. But I tend to find that, like, obviously I've got stories about the power of stories, and I tend to find that those don't tend to work as well unless it's a very specific context. So no, I get your friend did you a solid with the kill your darlings advice.
It wasn't working for sure. It is definitely more of a workshop example, but I do think that the stories that are also feel good or connect to people as humans and how they're treated, people respond to so well. I also do a lot of work with storytelling with data, just like you describe. And the goal with storytelling with data isn't to talk about the data or the numbers. It's to talk about the people behind it, the individuals, and the connection to it. Because once you connect to it, you see those things you can't unsee, and it makes those numbers be far more meaningful.
Yeah, I had lower on my I don't have an agenda, but I have a list of things I want to talk to you about. So you talked about data storytelling, so I want to jump on that one now then. So in your experience with data storytelling, do you find that, because I've seen different approaches to that. Some people like to use a story that humanizes the data. Okay, so let me pick one data point that is actually also known as a human being and share a story that lets you see and care about this person. Some people talk about the story of the data. So how did you come about this data? How did you found out about the problem? So do you always tend to prefer one approach over the other? What other approaches do you think are also useful?
Yeah, there's multiple, because any story, whether it's data or a story in general, is not a story for story's sake. It's because you want some desired outcome for your audience. You want them to know, think, feel, or do something. So in storytelling with data, I have different situations that I help people work through of why is there an opportunity to tell the story? What is it that you want people to do? Is this just an update? Is this where there's a decision or a discussion needed? Is there some type of action? You start there because that helps inform what you're trying to do. Then you start to look at the data to see, well, what is the interesting piece of it? Is it that there's a really big scale here where we want to tell the story of one person and then zoom out to the scale of it? Or is it that there's an outlier in the data? There's something that's unexpected that we want to explore more? Or is it just that we haven't talked about it in a while and we want to come in and look at it? And so I don't believe there's any one approach that works in every situation. It's really working through what is it that you're trying to achieve. And then once you get clear on that and what your audience already knows and thinks about it, then you can work through what the right story is to connect them to it. Most often what happens, I find when I work with companies, is people come in with 50 pages of data that have 12-point font and 75 pieces of data on one slide. They put it up and they say, I'm not going to talk to this. And eyes glaze over and no one really knows what to do with it. And so part of it is whomever has worked with the data is the closest to it. And your responsibility is to then communicate that with others and communicate it in a way that people can follow. The tendency is, I have to give you all the data, but more data is more. So it's really, what are the critical pieces to discuss and understand, and then put the rest in the appendix. And you can look at that, or it's a pre-read or something. But when you're getting to the point of an action, you have to guide where that goes. And what I love about storytelling with data is it brings everyone to the same common spot. Because if I say, 35% of people sent in their performance reviews on time, and we asked a room full of people, why do you think that is? You would get, because they're lazy, because they don't believe in it. No, the system was down. There were no communication. There's many different reasons why. And what happens when we see data in our heads is we each have those reasons. We each have our own interpretation of it. And we don't know that they're different from the people around us. So when we then start to talk about it without any level setting or context, we're approaching it from so many different spots. And when you tell a story with data, you're bringing everyone to the same common place for a starting point of a conversation. Everyone doesn't have to agree with that place, but you're able to start and have a more constructive conversation than when you're debating and not realizing you're approaching it from different angles.
Yeah, I think I've heard you talk about how one of the problems of data in general, but also things like employee surveys, is that people tend to question the data. If the data shows something that they don't think is right, or they don't want it to be right, then there is this tendency of going, well, how was this collated? How many people have answered this questionnaire? Well, what were the questions asked exactly? Where I guess that one thing that is almost always true about storytelling is when you share a story, assuming people have no reason to believe that you're lying, and I think usually they don't, they will take that data point to be true. Now, that doesn't mean that that is the truth for every other data point, or is the only data point that they should consider, but at least you can start with something that is not typically up for debate, and that flashes out the issue in a way that just the numbers might not, as you said. Otherwise, everybody's coming from a different perspective, and then how do you have a conversation if everybody's working with a different set of information just because it's coming out of their own heads.
I think also if you are finding that you are having these debates about data, so I've had a couple different clients get survey or feedback data from clients, and the immediate reaction is they don't know what they're talking about. Like that they don't know. They have no idea what they need, what they want. They don't know. And then they do focus groups or they do an interview and they are in front of the person asking questions, connecting to a human that gets the color around the data. And all of a sudden they're like, that's brilliant. We didn't see it that way. We didn't know. And so if you find that you are questioning the data, you are questioning the people behind it or the validity, it's that you haven't connected with it. Because we do make decisions through emotions. And so part of what we have to do in this world of making data informed decisions is connect people to the data. And storytelling is a way to do that through many different methods, depending on what you want to do.
Yeah, something I've started saying not that long ago actually was along the lines of that if you don't have the data, you don't know. But if you don't have the stories, you don't care, or at least people think you don't care, because they are much more compelling evidence that you actually know what's going on with individuals in your team, with your coach, and the data, even if it is accurate, even if it is representative, when it's not something that ever is going to make anybody feel heard and understood.
Yeah.
And it's just not that convincing if you're trying to use that with leadership. When you go up there and say, oh, 70% of our employees feel disengaged. I mean, it might not be a nice number to look at, but it's very different to say, here is 77 stories from this department of the experience they're having right now with whatever, and one that they are not happy with. Here's some we selected from you, but there's another 75 here if you want to have a look at them. I think that becomes a lot harder to deny that there is an issue if you're looking at that, other than just looking at a percentage.
I love that expression you use. It sums it up perfectly. I always point people to what charities do, because charities are trying to solve problems at scale. And take like the Red Cross. Anytime there's a natural disaster, they don't start with the number hundreds of thousands impacted. They start with the story of a family, a person, whatever. So you understand what's really happened to their home, their lives, their ability to just do basic things like get food. And then when you understand that, they zoom out to scale. And charities do this, right? They're reliant on getting funding from us to be able to do what they need to do. And to do that, we need to care. And to care, we need to understand the problems in a different way. And so they are masters of how they are connecting you really to data. It's just you don't realize that's what's happening as you're being told stories of individuals, and then they zoom out and show that impact.
One question, now that you mentioned charity, I don't know if it's a conundrum or a paradox that I've discussed with other people, and I don't think there is a clear answer to this, but there is research which I think is fairly well known in storytelling circles about, the one about Rokia, the little girl in Mali, and this where essentially they gave people the data about children that are hungry in Mali and asked for donations, and then they tried just the story of this one little girl called Rokia, and then they tried the story and the data. And just the story does better when it comes to donations than any of the other variations. And I don't think there is data backing up that type of research for other issues that are not charity. But if there were any, do you know any research that backs up that doesn't apply to other things?
Yeah, there's a similar piece of research, but I'm thinking it's charity, and I'm sure you know it. It's from Dr. Paul Zak, where he, his lab did the brief film of the young boy with cancer. So first group sees the young boy who's lost his hair to chemo, and his father goes on camera and says that he's trying really hard to be present for the remainder of his son's life. And then you see him at the zoo group gets just this father and son, and the son doesn't have hair, but you don't hear anything about it. And so those that saw the first one not only had the stronger reactions, the oxytocin spikes, but they actually donated their participation fee voluntarily. And then the same with the other. So it's I think in the same flavor, but it all comes down to the neurochemicals and what we're responding to, which is what we both love to talk about, right? Storytelling isn't this fluffy thing. It is how you are intentionally engaging the brain to communicate and create meaning for people.
What I find challenging is that knowing what I think we know about the science of it, but not necessarily having broader non-charity related research to fill in some of the gaps in our knowledge. The research that there is suggests that you shouldn't even talk about the data. You should just talk about the story. But that doesn't make any real sense in a corporate environment. And I do wish that there was research to back up what I think is the more sensible approach, and I believe you too, which is, sure, use the stories to humanize the data, probably start with the story, and then, okay, listen, let's look at this slightly broader perspective, because if the charity research got shown that it works exactly the same way outside of the charity domain, those would be very strange meetings and presentations we're going to have when we're not taking into account the data, or I should say, it's not that we don't take into account, we're not quoting it.
Yeah,
in a sense, we would have to just position as this is an example of the problem that exists on a broader scale, but I'm not going to talk to you about it, because if I talk in a broader scale, you stop caring. So let me just talk about this one person.
I do think there's leeway. Once you connect people to the emotions through a story, you can share data. The problem most people get into is they share way too much data. And when you focus first on what are you trying to have people do with the data, it's often 1, 2, 3 pieces that are needed for that. And maybe there's some supplemental, but people tend to have so much data that it creates confusion. I think the anecdotal research is what we saw happen through Apple when Steve Jobs was leading. He did those presentations that everyone loved. There was data in it. You just didn't realize, because he would tell the very compelling story that would have the very simple images and slick slides, and he would take you through it. And there would just be these things peppered in, but you didn't realize because you were just in love with this device that you were going to go stand in line and get. So it's this interesting thing I find in business where I continually come up against people that say, I can't tell stories, I have to use data. And then when I try to show them it's both, people are still convinced it's either or. And it's not. There's an and there for sure. It's probably not all story, but it's more story than people think. And it's not all data. It's less data than people think.
You talked about the science and how we know that story is not this fluffy thing. One thing I don't really know the answer for is how much sharing the science behind storytelling. I mean, I of course that gives us credibility, and I think anyone that does work for in storytelling in the corporate world, we will share some of the science. It's very rare that I don't think I've seen a keynote from anyone that doesn't have a little bit of the science in there just to prove that it's not a fluffy thing. But what I'm not convinced of is that the science makes people want to be storytellers. I think there's an element of, okay, you've ticked that box for me. You've proved that this is not nonsense. But I have seen people agree about how powerful it is, talking about the science or not, but then they don't go and tell stories. So I think, so I don't know if to what extent we still, we know we have to talk about the science because it's powerful and all of that, but I don't know if there isn't an element of us overvaluing how much people understanding that story is not a fluffy thing actually works.
So this is my jam. We're right in the center of where I love to play, because I think that it's not enough to talk about the science. It's what do you then do with the science? And that's where my book is focused, but not in a sciencey way, because as soon as you start saying neuroscience, some people freak out. But where I've had a lot of success with your engineer, your auditor, your logical thinker that doesn't feel like there's a place for storytelling is where I expand on the science and I talk about what I call are the 5 factory settings of the brain. And they build on different things that are going to naturally happen in how your brain responds to information versus stories, and how you then can use them and plan for them in stories. And so it is almost teaching the skeptics, here's how you hack storytelling, because you can work through these things and get a story, get a narrative or structure that's going to be engaging more of the brain than just a communication. And that's where I've had the light bulbs go off of, it's not just, let's talk about neural coupling and let's talk about, even decision making. It's getting to, here is what happens when you are doing and planning for these things. And so I love that approach for exactly what you said, because anytime I'm approached for a keynote, this happened just the other day, someone said, well, how are you going to relate what we do to business? Like, how are you going to relate storytelling to business? I'm like, I'm not writing novels. I too have sat on the other side of the desk, having to persuade employees or leaders, or been in organizations where very few people could say yes and very many people could say no. And this is, how are you sharing information in a way that connects with people that is going to be more compelling? And I find that actually leaning into the science, but not just here's the science, but here's what you then do with the science when you're planning a story, is what seems to bridge that, like, okay, I get it, to, okay, I can try this. This makes sense. There's something here for me to do.
I had a question I wanted to ask about something you just said, which is to do with not necessarily the science as a way to get credibility for storytelling or to show how powerful it can be, but how much that influenced you as a storyteller. Because I have the feeling, this is not based on solid information, but I would guess you were already telling stories and you're probably pretty good at it before a lot of the science came out, because a lot of the science is fairly recent. And I'm saying this and I'm asking this on the basis that I understand the science. I think I'm fairly caught up in the science, to the science. But I'm not 100% sure that knowing the science has influenced dramatically the way I tell stories. And I know other people that work in the story world that are very heavy on the science. And when I've seen them do kind of workshop type of things, and they're talking about the science constantly, I'm always missing the practical step, which is, well, it's great talking about how you need to, how you're going to generate oxytocin by telling a story, but what are the words that should come out of the person's mouth that actually will do that, right? Or the dopamine or whatever you're focusing on. Just saying, generate some dopamine by increasing the tension in your story. Great. How? Yeah. So how has it affected you when it comes to the stories you tell?
Well, first, I echo your sentiments when I hear that. I do judge and roll my eyes hard every time I see people say, tell a story. Like, that's not helpful at all. At all. We know it, but what people don't know is, where do I find an idea for a story? How do I tell a compelling story? How do I do this? I judge as well on just tell a story that gives oxytocin. Like, no one knows when their oxytocin is spiking, although there are very cool ways to measure that now, which is amazing in the science of it. And so I have tried to focus on, what do you do that implements and activates those things? I have a background in psychology, and so when I studied, you are correct. The science that we understand now has been past 15, 20 years. And really, even the past 10 years, there's been amazing leaps and bounds. So when I studied, it was about human connection and interaction. And so there were things that I understood of, by doing this, this is what happens, but I didn't necessarily understand why. As I've understood the science, it's helped me in how I explain it to others. Part of my approach is I've internalized this. And so I don't necessarily follow the same exact steps the way I explain it to someone that's trying to do it for the first time, because I've figured out what works for me, but I'm trying to give them an approach they can take so they can figure out what works for them. But I definitely do think about, have I pulled enough of the right levers? Because So I mentioned Dr. Paul Zak, big fan of him. He's such a supporter of the storytelling community and has really, I think, changed where storytelling is going because his lab can actually measure your oxytocin spikes through wearable devices on your arm. So his platform measures whatever you want to test, commercials, TED Talks, different things. And you can actually see, a leader can see, is my message engaging and immersing the brains of people, or am I boring them? You can start to see, they can measure, are we having psychological safety? And in a non-invasive way, it's all through your wearable device. And so learning things like that and starting to experiment with how do I then make tweaks to my story to get it to be more immersive is things that I've played with and tried to figure out how to pass on to others. That said, there's an art to storytelling. It's not all methodical, check, 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 and then you're good. But I do think that those checks get you further along so you can play with some of those other things. I find for my own storytelling, I'm continually experimenting with it. I'm playing with my voice. I'm trying to figure out how I do it differently, what I can do that's compelling, because it's very easy to get stuck in a rut. And I'm a fan of comedians. I am constantly studying movies and looking at different things that are story in the world to try to get ideas from them.
Yeah, Paul Zak, I couldn't agree more. He is a delightful human being. Yeah. I had him on the show quite a while back, before, not that the show is huge or anything, but before I had 100+ episodes to back up what I was doing. And I remember, as soon as we finished the recording, I said, and we're done. And he said, "Wow, you're such a professional." And I'm like, "What? I'm recording this in my girl's room. How am I such a professional?" And then he had some really kind words to say about some of the stuff I had done. And it was probably the first time that I thought, actually, maybe maybe this is not such a ramshackle operation.
No, and it's genuine. Like, that's who he is. But I also love that, he himself is an amazing storyteller. So one of the things that I did for my book is I wanted to not just share my perspective on storytelling. I wanted to show there's so many ways to do this. So each chapter ends with a different interview of a storyteller, a little vignette, 500 words, to show you the variety. So Dr. Zak is one of them, as a neuroscientist, and I've got television correspondent, a Pixar creative director, Sundance founder, Moth executive producer, like people that do this in many different ways. And it was so fun going behind the scenes with him and learning about his process and how he actually uses science to test his stories and see how it's going. So he himself is an amazing storyteller and also just such a kind, generous person with the storytelling community. He's always supporting and sharing ideas, and I encourage anyone. He's an easy follow to see different ideas and where some of the places in the field is going.
Well, it's not for nothing that his nickname is Dr. Love.
It's true, yeah.
But now that you say what you've done in your book, it sounds like I need to get to that book, or at least to the list of the people that you have interviewed, to see who am I missing and who have I gotten already and who am I missing.
It was really fun.
Matthew Lunn is one of the people that you've gotten there.
Say that again?
The Pixar guy. Matthew, is he Matthew Lunn?
No, I went to people. No, this is a former creative director who worked on Finding Nemo, Monsters Inc. So I went to people that you would either recognize their role or their name. So many people know the Moth and Sarah Austin Jenness, or Manoj Zomorodi, who's the TED Radio Hour podcast host. But I also found in the US, the University of Minnesota Medical School teaches storytelling to their physicians, and they have these story slams and they do things to create community, to lower the rate of suicide with their physicians and to teach them how to connect better with patients. And so there's a physician in there. There's a wonderful man, Evan Skolnick, who writes stories for video games, which the stories come after the games are built. Like, it was just fascinating. I have a museum director from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, which had one of the greatest art thefts in the past 30 years. And so it was fun taking people that just have to tell stories in so many different ways, in so many different contexts, and then seeing what was similar, what was different. One that's just a delight, I'm such a fan, is Drew Dudley, who has the TED podcast on everyday leadership. And his approach, he talked about listening to the radio and listening to baseball announcers describe the atmosphere in the park and the game, and how he learned storytelling just from watching sports and having to be on long car trips and tell stories to his family. And so it really was, I love doing what you're doing, right? Getting the chance to talk to people about how they approach this, because it's just so cool.
Yeah, and the other thing as well is I am delighted to know that this is a storytelling book that I will probably enjoy reading more than many of the storytelling books that seem to be out there. Not because people are not good writers or good storytellers, because they often are, but because there is this, I'm not sure if it's a tendency, but a lot of people who have written storytelling books, ideally people that, not ideally, but typically people that are not necessarily, haven't sold it to Harper and Collins. You have 3 or 4 chapters that are exactly the same in every single storytelling book, because everybody feels compelled to talk about the science, and there isn't necessarily 100 different ways you can go about it. So it's all great, and I've used some of it before, but I've actually, like, in my talk, I've made a point of not talking about Balzac, not talking about neurocoupling, and not talking about the significant objects experiment, because it's all great and it's amazing evidence, but I just couldn't deal with it anymore. I was like, no, let me find some other stuff,
Totally
or my
get
own
it.
angle, because I've read it so many times.
So many. You could almost cut and paste. And that was my goal too, I didn't want it to be this copy and paste, which is really where the 5 factory settings came from. It was, if I look across the neuroscience and the way our brain just responds to communication, how do I package this in a way that is going to be different and compelling? So I tried very hard to make it different, because there are a million storytelling books out there. So what I find does not work in business is that there's a lot of books that hold up the hero's journey as a model, and I find that is not really the best thing for business leaders. They will get stuck in the model trying to figure out how they work their story into it, and they lose their place and who's the guide on the side. And it gets so overwhelming and frustrating that they abandon it. Or I also don't believe that there's 4 stories you have to tell. I had a leader, the beginning of COVID, come to me, a multinational company. They were office culture, and for the first time, everyone's at home. And by the 3rd week, he came to me and he said, I know I need to reach out every week and send communications to the employees, but I don't know what to say, because the origin story, the where we're going story, why we can't stay here, like none of that was relevant. And so I understand the intent of both, right? The intent is so good of, let's give you a model, but there's other models. There's so many, any model can work. It's whatever works for you, right? It's whatever you can organize. But my goal is, I want to teach people to be able to figure out how they can tell a story that's the right story for that audience. And the reason the book is called The Perfect Story comes from the last line of my TED Talk, because people think, oh, I can't tell a story. I don't have a good story. I don't have a perfect story. No one does. You take your stories and you make them perfect. And that's the approach that I'm trying to help people do, is like, you can do this. There's more than 4 stories to tell. You can tell any story for any situation when you work the process to make sure you're checking the boxes of what you want to get out of it.
There was one of the first books about storytelling that I read when I started my own sort of storytelling professional journey, was one that is a very popular one.
We're not going to talk. Yeah. It always is, and it's
particularly because the author has still not come to my podcast, so I hold a very heavy grudge. But I remember I had Paul Smith on the show, and he had a bestseller on storytelling quite a while back. And he has this, I think it's a great book called The 10 Stories Every Leader Should Tell, or something like that, which is like a super quick read. It's like he said, it was literally bought as an airport read. Like, can you write a book that people read? And I was looking through them, and I said, Paul, how many story types do you know? Because this is like the 3rd or 4th book you're writing. And it's like, I haven't really counted them in a while, but I think I got up to like 180. And I'm like,
Yeah.
I, I'm surprised you managed to find categories for that many stories.
But you can make
I,
it up
I
for
struggle to find.
anything. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that what is unfortunate when people hear like, here are the 4 stories you have to tell. We do this in sales. We do this in different things. And the intent is, let me help you get unstuck and find a place to start, which is good. But that story isn't going to fit in every context. What I am trying to do is help people figure out what is the context, what is the outcome you're trying to get to, and then figure out the story to get there. And then there's so many ways to do that. And so I get frustrated when people come and think like, oh, but there's this really popular book and they said this is the model and we have to do this. Like, no, there's so many models, there's so many ways, there's so many stories. Don't If you're getting boxed in to the point where it's stopping you from telling your story, then you need to take a different approach.
Not that I don't have story types. I have some that some people find useful, but what I tend to use with most people is it just comes out of my, I think it's my definition. I don't think I've ever heard someone phrase it this exact way, but I say to people, outside of business, storytelling can be many things. But in business, storytelling is something very basic because a story is a real life example that makes a point. That's it.
Yep.
Right? It's something that happened to somebody somewhere, sometime, and you're using it to make your point. So whatever you want to talk about, has it ever happened to anybody? Has it happened to you? Has it happened to a colleague of yours? Has it happened in another company? Can you share that example before you drown us in data and statistics and whatever? Because if you're doing that, that is storytelling. That's it. So you mentioned earlier that someone asked you, how are you going to connect this to business? And to me, this question can only be asked by someone who has this highfalutin, fictionalized hero's journey type of idea of what a story actually is.
Yeah.
Because, has anything interesting happening in your office last week? Oh, yes, John did this thing. That's a story. Right. Might not be a good one, but it's probably a story.
The other one that just is so funny to me is when people will say, I can't talk about emotions and senses in business. And I'm like, you think you're not emotional in business? Like frustrated, tired, exasperated, annoyed, elated, celebratory. We're a mode of people. There are colors all around your office. There's the random paperclip on the floor of the conference room. There's the sound that the photocopier makes. Like this happens every day, yet we think like, oh, I can't talk about that. No, you absolutely should talk about that because that's what's going to get people to pay attention. And so we just have these misconceptions of not only the models and what it could be, but that there's a certain persona we have to have in business and we can't do those things. And that is an unfortunate mindset because we are emotional at work. Emotional doesn't mean that you're laying on the floor kicking and screaming and sobbing most days.
Yeah, it's this again, it's another confusion, right? Where they think that being like talking about emotions is being emotional. Or as I like to think, just because you're talking about emotions, that doesn't mean you need to go emo on your audience, right? You can just say, I was just really frustrated. I was trying that and it just wasn't working. I was like, that's you're displaying emotion. That doesn't mean you need to go, what if I cannot do this? My professional life is now over, and then you start crying. This is not how people talk and communicate. But it shouldn't come across as if it has no bearing on your life and it doesn't matter in any way. Because at the end of the day, if it matters, it's almost in the vast majority of cases because of how it's going to make you feel. Most of us are not in life or death situations where the consequences by themselves are tragic. What the problem is that we don't like when things don't work. It makes us frustrated, makes work harder. People get stressed. So they're emotions, they're feelings. They're not drama. Drama is a very different thing.
Well, not to mention, we know that teams that are able to foster psychological safety tend to be higher performing. So it's not that they're 100% comfortable, but they're practicing this trust around each other. And that gets to emotions. Being able to be vulnerable and constructively challenge someone or talk about a mistake and lessons learned and not feel like you're going to be blamed. Like, mistakes have emotions. All of this has emotions. And the more that we can start to verbalize that, it it makes a difference. I saw a CEO in an all hands meeting land on the employees in a way that they didn't like. So he was in a room full of people and it was broadcast globally. At the same time, layoffs were going on. And in the room, the vibe was okay. But there was some laughter. There was, he was trying to create this positive energy. But people on the simulcast who have just heard about layoffs watch the CEO laughing and they're mad. They feel like it's completely inconsiderate. What is he doing? Fill up all the message boards inside the company. And within 2 hours, he read them and he realized his mistake. And so he got a camera and he went on camera and he apologized and he owned it. And he was vulnerable. And he said, I messed up. I was insensitive. I'm sorry. And he owned it. And like that, the messages on the message boards completely changed because they appreciated he expressed emotions. He expressed that he made a mistake and it made such a shift. And so the more we're willing to be able to include some of these things, the more dynamic conversations are going to be, but also the more memorable, the more informative, and the more people are going to take action on them.
When it comes to culture, what do you find? I mean, either from the work you used to do before when you were working directly with culture and the work you do now, how do you find are some of the interesting ways to use storytelling with culture other than asking people for their stories so you actually know what's going on and they feel valued and heard and understood? So what have you found that does work when it comes to storytelling?
There are so many things. It is really endless because so Stanford did research on how you shape culture, and what they said is using stories, having rituals, like performance management is a ritual, heroes, so telling stories about the heroes in the organization, and then shared values, which are common habits, things and that make you feel like the company. They have the greatest impact on culture. And so when a leader tells a story about a mistake they made, they're sending a signal to the rest of the team that this is okay and let's talk about this. A story is going to demonstrate what is encouraged or discouraged. A story is going to help show what great looks like. So I'll often work with organizations on, let's look at, what do your best people leaders do? What does that look like? What do your best teams do? And let's start telling some of those stories, because then your person that's promoted to people leader can understand what great looks like and they can start to see what to aspire to. So in culture, in an organization, we'll often build a communication plan all the way down of what types of things do we want to make sure that the senior leadership team is sharing stories about? How does that look across different stakeholders? And how are you intentional about creating this storytelling culture? Because it is doing so much work for you. I played a concert in a retirement home. I play the flute, and in the middle of the concert, I look up, and in the center of this dining hall is this disco ball. And I was like, good for them. You can tell that these people who were there with walkers and oxygen and canes and different things were living their best life, because they were in this room that was cared for. It was warm, but also it was fun. There was exercise equipment that looked like it had been used. The disco ball wasn't dusty. And it showed me, that tells me more about this organization than any of their values on the website and any of the things in a pamphlet, because it's showing me the true experience of it. It's showing me that on a Saturday, they turn the lights down and they say, this one is Ladies' Choice. And they get up and probably sway to Glenn Miller or whatever song they want. And they love that. And so we all have disco balls on our teams. We all have these different things, and stories put that up there and help us understand and connect to it more meaningfully than values on the website, because they're showing that true day to day. And that day to day is where each employee is non-verbally deciding to stay or leave. Because when anything happens and someone says, I'm out, it's because of one of those moments. And the more stories you can tell, the more you can help connect people to what is important and help them feel like they belong.
There is that Jeff Bezos quote, which is, your brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room.
Yeah.
And I like to say that your culture are the stories your people share about you when you're not in the room. And if you
There's
don't
one
know what those
question.
stories are,
Yeah, there's
and
one
you
question. Sorry about that. I was just say there's one question I guide companies to ask, which is, how would your friends and family describe the culture here? And every time that people have asked that, they get such rich insights, and it is spot on, because our families and our friends see us in these best moments, in these worst moments, in that thing that makes us be so annoyed, and that thing that makes us feel celebrated. It is absolutely the heart of it.
there is an exercise that I find very entertaining to do in workshops, which is when, even if you have the boss in the room, the person who hired you, is you just ask them, can everybody just tell me what your values are, your company values are, your team values are, and then you look to the boss and goes like, you can't participate for now, and then everybody gets very confused. They can never guess, and then sometimes you ask the boss and he goes like, integrity. It's like, no, that's not one of the ones you have up there on the website. And it's just one of those things that it just, I think, it's lost into corporate gobbledygook.
Yeah,
I forgot what
gobbledygook.
second
Yeah,
word.
yeah.
Gobbledygook. It's just a theory that has no real practical application. And then, once it comes up against real human reality, it just goes up in smoke. I mean, there's that really cool research that I think Kendall Haven, no, it's shared on the Lisa Cron's book, Wired for Story, where I think it was a researcher spent 4 years talking to thousands of business executive audiences and asking them this question. Imagine one of your new employees has just gone through 20 hours of professional design training, and then as soon as they come out of the training and go to the office, another employee who they've never met before comes up to them and says, listen, come over here, let me just tell you a story about how things really work around here. And then she asked the executives, what do you think the new employee is going to believe, the 20 hours of training or the 10-minute story? And without exception, everyone says, well, they believe the story, of course.
Absolutely.
So I think it's one of those things where companies don't quite realize how easily their best laid plans can go to waste if the culture that welcomes new people is not the one that they think it is.
I also think, we always talk about a learning culture. Stories are the fastest way to develop people at scale, and they are low cost. And it's just a missed opportunity when you're not actively sharing them.
Yeah, someone could argue that they are pretty old and proven learning technology.
Yes, I like
Yeah,
that.
the metaverse, it's still to be seen how useful that is for teaching people stories. Have a bit of a track record,
Yeah,
you could argue.
absolutely.
Um, Right. So just one final question, and this is kind of loose in the other topics we talked about. But I've heard you say that you like the idea of a back pocket story, which I believe is a story you keep in your back pocket. But at the same time, you have said before that you don't like the idea that there's only this specific set of stories to tell. So what would you advise people to have as a back pocket story? Does it vary from person to person? How does that work?
So this idea came because I am an introvert that in social settings, my mind goes blank. So it's not that I don't like being around people, but I, in true introvert style, like to be able to reflect and think. And so I would go into networking events or dinners. I would be at the business dinner, and my table would be silent and nobody could think of what to say. And all the other tables in the restaurants would be laughing. And you look at them and be like, why can't I be at that table? And it just felt so awkward. And at one business dinner, this guy out of nowhere shares this story about moving a wood pile in his home. He was getting ready to build a deck. He moves this wood pile, and as he takes off a stack of wood, there's this raccoon staring him in the face. And he's completely surprised, and he backs up. And so he's telling this story and he's acting it out. And all of a sudden, this table that was the introverts of introverts that were just dying at how painful the dinner was came alive. I don't even think he finished the story because other people started chiming in and it made everything happen. And I realized he probably has used that story many times. That wasn't, this probably didn't just happen, but it shifted the energy. And so the back pocket story is if you are someone that social settings are uncomfortable or your mind is blank or you're not sure what you want to say, it's a story that you can use that doesn't necessarily have a point. It doesn't have a most wanted action other than break the ice and make this a lot less uncomfortable. So it can be something that you just read. Like I read how airbags were inspired by origami because they have to be folded a certain way to be able to fit inside the steering wheel. And so it could be something random like that. It could be one of your personal experiences. It's just something that you can put out in a setting where it is awkward and uncomfortable and you do not want to talk about the weather. So it doesn't have to have a point other than I'm just going to put this out there because I've seen people use stories like a raccoon in a woodpile in a business setting, and it changed everything.
I think it's probably worth mentioning that it's not a terrible idea if you're going to have a back pocket story to run it by someone else just to make sure that your judgment is not impaired. And I say this thinking of myself because the moment you talked about the airbag, my mind just went to Dr. Kellogg, the guy who invented Kellogg's, the breakfast cereal. And I don't know if you know this, and I'm sorry if you don't, but do you know why he invented Kellogg's?
No.
You know, the cereal?
I don't think I do, no.
He, apart from being kind of a scientist, he also worked into this, I think it was a sanatorium, and he was concerned about his patients' sexual urges. So he wanted to invent food that was bland because he believed that would diminish their urges. And I heard that and I was like, this is really weird. This can't be true. And then I went and researched it, and then you find that this was a big crusade in his life, that like he didn't want people to have any of these types of desires in their life. And I'm like, I can never look at Tony the Tiger the same way again.
But
maybe that is not, maybe that's not a back pocket story.
Play this out. Let's play this out. So let's say we were at a conference and we walk up to each other and I tell you this, airbags, hi, nice to meet you. I'm Karen. Hi, I'm Francisco. I just read this really weird article about airbags. And then that triggers for you this, and you tell me this story. All of a sudden, it is not awkward. We're laughing. We're having this really dynamic conversation. And over the course of the 2 or 3 days that we're at this conference, every time we see each other, I'm going to be pointing at you and you're going to be pointing at me. And we're going to walk up to each other and talk, no problem. And we're probably going to connect and be able to talk after the event. It doesn't matter what it is. It matters that it is something that you can have in the moment that can work, because my story triggered your story. Your story is going to trigger another. So pick whatever's right for you. I vary it. I don't have the same one every time, but I do, as a pretty introverted introvert, I do make sure that I've got something, because otherwise I feel awkward sitting there and I get the idea 10 minutes after we all leave. So I'm a big fan of it because of what just happened. Same thing happens in real life.
I think you're too kind, and I'm going to retire the Kellogg in the Kellogg's motivation story and bring out another one. Not that I'm normally the type of person who is short of things to say. It's probably the opposite. I have to make an effort sometimes at dinner parties to just ask a whole bunch of stuff and shut up instead of just sharing all the stories that I want to share. But
I'll give you a new Kellogg story. So your story triggered for me that the movie It's a Wonderful Life, which is many years old, that to make snow, they painted cornflakes white. And then that used to be what was snow in movies. And so it evolved from where it began into a movie prop for people.
Fair enough. I think that's a much nicer and cuter twist to the Kellogg story than the one I was just saying I went with, but that's the actual reality. This is not my twisted mind doing anything. Yeah. The twisted mind wasn't mine in this particular case. Karen, if people want to find out more about you, I mean, they can obviously look up your TED talk, which is in TED.com now. So if they look for Karen Eber or for storytelling, they'll find you there easily enough. Where else do you want to send people to?
My website's the best place. It's my name, KarenEber.com. I have a whole bunch of stories in there and brain food and information about the book and different resources for anyone interested in learning more.
And when is the book coming out?
Next fall.
Okay. Is it written already, or are you still
No,
suffering
it's done.
through it?
No, it's been done for a while. Publishing is really long. It's been done about 4 months, so it's still
Pretty good.
unfortunately a bit
Very
of time to
fast
go. Yeah, I
That's
had a lot
very
to
fast
say.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right. Well, I'm glad we finally got over technical difficulties, health issues, and all sorts of other problems that we finally done this. Thank you very much for your time. This was great.
Thank you. It was such a joy.
All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves, and until next time.